Ki te mana whenua o tēnei takewa, nai tua huriri, kei te mihi, kei te mihi, kei te mihi. Ko Jessica Halliday, tōka wingoa, ko ahau te kaiwhakahaere o te Pūtahi, Centre for Architecture and City Making. So good evening, everyone, and thank you all for joining us online and here in person at Tūranga. I'm Jessica Halliday, the Director of Te Pūtahi, and it's my pleasure to introduce this evening's event. And I don't have the clicker, Em. So can you give me the next slide? Thanks. I'd like to thank those who have made tonight's event possible. He whakawhiti kōrero Christchurch Conversations is funded through the Christchurch City Council Sustainability Fund. Thank you, Thomas. And has the curatorial support of Associate Professor Amanda Yates from AUT's He Puna Ora Regenerative Action Lab. Thanks also to the Transportation Group for supporting our thinking on tonight's topic. Tonight's He Whakawhiti kōrero Christchurch Conversations is about opening our imaginations, about seeing our neighbourhood streets in a new light. And why? For a heap of reasons, but here's just a few. Streets make up a really large part of our public spaces, so we should think creatively about what kind of outcomes we want from them. Say, for example, most people want action on climate change, but often we feel that change is too hard. But starting with our neighbourhood streets could make a significant difference. In Christchurch, 38% of greenhouse gas emissions come from vehicles using fossil fuels to travel on our streets. And some data a few years ago revealed that short car trips under 2 kilometres in New Zealand make up nearly a third of all car trips, which averages out to around 12 short trips per household per week. So there's a huge opportunity for us to switch our mindset and instead of defaulting to the car for a short run to the shops or school, switch it out for cycling, walking, scootering or public transport instead. But for this to be an easy thing to do, we need to think about how to make the streets in our neighbourhoods, the ones closest to our homes, the streets we use when we travel 2 kilometres or less, more conducive to active and public transport. As you'll hear tonight from our incredible speakers, there are significant co-benefits to this approach. Changing our neighbourhood streets to change how we move around our neighbourhoods isn't just about lowering greenhouse gas emissions from transport. It results in unlocking a whole lot of other goods. Improved health, safety, better childhood, more space for biodiversity, increased opportunities for social connection in our most common public space, the neighbourhood street. The social benefits, if you think about it, are huge. Just think about how many more people we'll all bang into in our neighbourhoods if we're walking out of them, out of our driveways, instead of driving sealed hermetically in a steel cage. I mean, if you think about it, these are the bits of roading that we all know best, right? We're the experts in them. And these are the places that we can potentially initiate change and support change if politicians will let us. So tonight, first we'll have 2 short presentations by local transport engineers. First, Glen Koorey will introduce us to neighbourhood street design concepts. And then Anne-Marie Head will talk about how a specific neighbourhood street here in Christchurch has been transformed in recent years. And then we have 2 further presentations with a focus on neighbourhood streets and children's lives. Louise Van Tongeren, the Christchurch City Council play advocate, will talk about the relationship between neighbourhood streets and play. And then Hannah Ballantyne, who is a Christchurch City Council Senior Engagement Advisor, is going to talk about the recent Aranui Streets for People project. To keep things moving, we're going to flow from one presenter to another, and each presenter will introduce themselves. And then after that, we move to a panel discussion where Glenn, Anne-Marie and Hannah will be joined by Susan Jennison, who is the principal of Westburn School. The panel discussion will be chaired by the editor of the press, Kamala Hayman. So whether you're attending the event online or you're in the room, you can ask the panel questions by texting your question to 021 110485. That is not the number on the screen. So I'll ask Em to change that because this slide will be on the screen with the correct number on it when the panel discussion is happening, and you'll be able to text your question to this number. And you'll also, if you're joining us online, you'll be able to use the chat function on YouTube as well. And then questions from both sources are conveyed to the panel by our team. And apologies in advance, it happens every time we get amazing questions, but we just don't get through all of them. And then after the panel discussion, Ciaran Fox will introduce tonight's poet, Jessica Arcus, and then we'll have a closing by Professor Simon Kingham, who's going to leave us with some thoughts for what next. So to kick us off, Glen, that's the correct number. Thank you, Em. Nice. To kick us off, please welcome Dr. Glen Koorey to the stage.
Okay, kia ora koutou. Ko Glen Koorey aho. I'm Glen Koorey with Verstrata. And I want to start tonight by talking about what it is that makes good streets. And I think we've got to remind ourselves that actually a lot of streets originally weren't really built to cater for motor vehicles. Okay, if you look at this photo here, might be one motor vehicle I think I can see in it. So we've got to think about how do we get back to having streets that actually can be for all. So, what makes good levers of neighbourhood streets? There's a few key things I want to talk about today. First one is actually having low traffic volumes. Less than 3,000 vehicles a day, in fact, ideally a lot less than 3,000, so you've got really quiet streets. That's pretty important. And there's a few different ways we can do this. Often it's tricks about what you do at the intersections, actually, to restrict traffic from going through them. Then we also want to have slow streets as well. 30 and 40 Ks, we're starting to see a lot of those around Christchurch now, and that's pretty important. Okay, again, we can do lots of tricks both at the intersection, but also more about the middle of the streets as to what we can do to make that work. And there's a few things we can do in terms of how we actually make the look of the street as well. Then we've got to think about what we might want to have within the street, what kind of amenities and services that we might want to provide. Okay, and it could be just things that are for comfort, things like seating and play areas, lighting's pretty important as well. But also the activities as well. What are we going to have people actually doing as well? Retail, commercial activities, so there's a bit of a buzz and vibe. And a lot of this has got to be tied in with ideally having some really nice natural features as well. Okay, so thinking about what we want to do in terms of greenery and also perhaps also incorporating aspects of water in there as well. Okay, so I want to just go back to a little bit of research that I did when I was at Canterbury University. There's a few interesting ones that sort of explain, I guess, the science behind what we're doing here. So this is one from about 15 years ago where I had a student looking at 4 different local streets with different volumes and asked a whole range of questions of the residents about how they found the street, their perceptions, how they use the street and so forth. This is just one example of one of the questions that was asked, would you let your kids play on the street? Are you comfortable with that? And Louise is going to talk a bit more about this concept of play later. But you can see quite clearly that, as you get to the busier streets, people were less comfortable about this idea. Okay, so that's really important, having quiet streets as an opportunity to interact with your neighbours and be comfortable letting your kids out as well. Another one we looked at a few years later was the whole question of width of the street as well. And we looked at differences between streets that were sort of big and open and those that were a bit more traffic calmed as well. Width alone, this is one street that's exactly the same, but has 2 quite different halves to it, as you can see. And there was a big difference in the mean speeds from the one end to the other as well. There was other bits of work that also looked at 2 different streets, sort of one that was treated, one that was sort of not treated. And there we go. And again, there was a range of questions that basically told us the same good news story, that the slow zones people felt a lot more comfortable with going along them, crossing them, and so forth. Last bit of research that was done a couple of years later was looking at the question of parking. It can be a bit of a contentious topic, but parking can actually be quite a useful calming device in its own right. And I had a student look into the effects of different levels of parking on different streets. So, you could have very low levels of parking, or it could be quite full of parking. And we looked at different widths of streets as well. Some are quite narrow, some are wider, but there was a pretty common thread throughout all of them. The more parking you put in, you definitely saw the speeds go down. It was often about 1k an hour per 10% of parking there. So parking can be your friend sometimes in terms of also having lower speed streets. Okay, so one of the types of streets I want to talk about here a bit right now is this concept of neighbourhood greenways. And we sort of picked them up from overseas. So there's some really good examples from Europe and North America, as you can see here. And they've got lots of other different names, bike boulevards, quiet ways, and so forth. We've taken the term neighbourhood greenways. In Christchurch, we've started doing quite a lot of these here. Anne-Marie's going to talk in a minute about the one along Sheldon Street there and how that's worked. The key with neighbourhood greenways is they actually have a lot of benefits to them. Okay, first one is they provide advantages for everyone who's walking or cycling, okay, because you've got that quieter, friendly street. It also makes it easier for people to go along the street, get across the busy roads, just by having less traffic along them. The other thing is, it's kind of in the name, neighbourhood, okay, that they do provide usually access to a lot of local facilities as well, your local shops, parks, schools and things like that as well. So that's important so we can get more people walking and cycling to those. Okay, the other thing too is if we come back to parking, often they don't have a big effect in actually reducing parking. We know we get a bit of grief for things like, say, separated cycleways taking away parking. Neighbourhood greenways don't tend to do that. And of course the greenway part as well is pretty important because you'll often see a lot of green aspects to the streets in there. Okay, so some of the tricks you need for those. Low speeds and traffic volumes. So some examples from overseas, and again here in Christchurch, we pretty much use 30k speed limits for our neighbourhood greenways here, and we look to do other sort of tricks as well, humps and bumps along the way to sort of slow them down and make them comfortable for people to use them, especially when you're biking. We also do other tricks at the intersections. If we're trying to get those volumes down, we need to find ways to sort of deter people and get them to use other routes instead. And so there's a whole bunch of things we can do to sort of stop people from going straight through. They have to go the long way round, and it just reduces the volumes you're going to see on those streets. And the greenway component is still pretty important as well. And there's some nice examples around the place. I wouldn't say the Christchurch example here is an actual greenway, but it illustrates the kind of things you can do where you've got good drainage features, swales and rain gardens alongside streets. We can do a lot more of those as well. Okay, the other thing we can do is we can introduce activity into our streets, and shared spaces are a good example of this. We've got lots of good examples from overseas. You know, you look at places like Europe, the UK and so forth, and really I guess they're made for it. You know, they've got relatively compact old style towns, but you know, we can do that here as well. And if we look at places like the CBD, it's not neighbourhood as such, but it's certainly a shared space that gets a lot of activity used by people. There's that activity because you're allowing some vehicles through and they're going slowly. The other thing you can do is have fun events as well. This is a really cool one I came across in Portland. They started in about 2008, about once a month over the summer. They would close down a loop of streets and they let people just walk, bike, hold events and so forth. And they're still going to this day. They're still doing Sunday parkways as well. And it's just a really good way to engage people in the neighbourhood streets and get them to say, this is fun, why can't we have another one? And that's basically how they've kept it going for so long. Okay, so some takeaway thoughts from all that. Okay, lowering traffic speeds and volumes, that really is the key. You want to have a pleasant street that it doesn't feel like there's lots of traffic and it's going fast. Okay, and there's lots of different ways you can do that, as you saw. It's also important how a street looks and feels. Okay, so this is where the urban design, the landscape design kicks in. So think about those aspects so you can make a street feel like it is just a really pleasant place. look for those opportunities for what I call street activation. Okay, what can people do on that street? Okay, and they could be things that are actually planned. You may have actual facilities there, but it could just be informal things as well. It could just be an opportunity that people can just hang around and play with something that you've created as well. Okay, again, I think Louise is going to touch on a bit more of that. Okay, and neighbourhood greenways I've shown you as one of the tools. All right, there's plenty of others, but that's definitely one that we're starting to embrace a bit here in Christchurch. Okay, and the beauty is everyone benefits. Even the motorists actually do benefit from a slower street as well. The residents definitely benefit from having a nicer street. Okay, so that's me, and I'll be very happy to take some questions and answers later on. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Glenn. Kia ora koutou. Tonight I'm going to talk about Sheldon Street in Woolston that was rebuilt as a neighbourhood greenway in 2019. I'm actually doing this on behalf of my colleague Jeanette Ward, who can't be with us tonight. She's actually on a plane to Vietnam. So this is Jeanette's house. Oh, hang on. This is Jeanette's house and her recently created mural that a group of us helped her paint as a celebration of the street. So in this presentation, firstly, I'm going to give you some context as to why the street was rebuilt, and then a brief overview of the street before and after, and then we'll hear from a resident, Kim, in a short video interview. So Sheldon Street is part of the Heathcote Express cycleway. The cycleway is the red line that extends from the edge of the central city to Heathcote and takes different forms depending on the context of the area it's travelling through. Sheldon Street is about halfway along the route. That's Jeanette's house in about 1910 with a young man outside with this bicycle. It seems destiny that this street would be part of a cycle route. Sheldon Street is now what we call a neighbourhood greenway, what Glenn was just talking about. So it's a street with low traffic volumes and, most importantly, low traffic speeds, so that cyclists can share the road with drivers, and of course people walking have a good footpath as well. This type of design means that a separate cycle lane isn't actually needed, but it still needs to be considered how you allocate the road space. Oh, it's in a different order. So if we look at the street before the transformation, you can see it's quite wide and straight, encouraging higher driving speeds. The footpaths are very narrow, especially next to power poles. In the distance, that intersection with Radley Street down the end is wide and open. It was very difficult to cross the road as a pedestrian or a cyclist. The street lighting levels were low, and it made the street uncomfortable to walk and cycle on at night. So if we look at the street now, you can see it's narrower and discourages higher driving speeds. This is reinforced with the lower speed limit of 30 k's an hour. There is less traffic lane definition, and you can see the footpaths are wider. Jeanette actually took this photo on the wheelie bin night, and you can see there is still footpath space available. Parking bays are defined in specific areas along the street, leaving much more space for other things like landscaping. The street lighting has been upgraded, and the street is more comfortable to use at night. And the biggest change, of course, is there are more people on the street. You see people stopping and chatting, and I've even seen people checking out our cool mural. So the landscaping is a mix of exotics and natives, which create pockets of interest when walking down the street, as well as shade on a sunny day. So overall, this street feels vibrant, safe, sustainable, and is helping to create a more sociable neighbourhood. And in some cases, pride in the street, with people taking ownership, whether it's weeding or just adding their own planting in where they can. I'm just going to go back a few slides. That's the one I missed. So here's an aerial view of the section of Sheldon Street where Jeanette's house is. And the key thing to note here is the intersection treatments at each end. along with the street space allocations, the way traffic is managed through that street is really important. At the western end, near the Heathcote River, the intersection was narrowed even more than it previously was, and speed humps were added to reduce vehicle speeds turning into and out of the street. But the main change was the intersection with Radley Street, which Glenn just showed before, where a wide pedestrian and cyclist crossing island was added, and drivers can only turn left out of the street or left into the street, and that stopped rat running that used to occur on that street. So this helps to keep the traffic volumes low and slow. It also provides a wide stage crossing for people using it, so it makes it much easier to cross here now. So who's this? This is Jeanette's neighbour, Kim. We're going to hear a short interview that Jeanette did with Kim on the street. Just note that when Kim says the street used to be two ways, she means it had two defined traffic lanes, and now it's one smaller carriageway. Hopefully this works.
So, Kim, you've lived in this street for quite a while now. Tell me about the changes that you've seen since the street was rebuilt as a neighbourhood greenway.
Well, obviously it used to be two ways and quite busy and quite fast traffic too. So there's been a cycleway put in and gardens down the bottom, and they built out into the roadway to slow the traffic coming round the corner at the bottom of the street, which really helps. Well, we haven't had any cars in our hedge since then.
Excellent. And what do you think about like the level of activity on the street now that it's part of the cycleway?
Well, it's quite busy at times, but it's just people biking, so it's not noisy. It's people chatting and biking in the mornings, people going off to work. It's lovely to see. And at the weekends we get families, lots of families on their bikes. It's lovely. The kids get a chance to get outside and be safe on a road. Yeah,
that's right. And I think when you think back to lockdown days, what I remember is some teenage girls here practicing their skateboarding.
Oh yeah,
because of the lack of traffic and the nice new road surface.
Yeah, I got my scooter out too.
Excellent.
On the new surface.
Yeah.
Fun.
Excellent. And tell me about the plants here in this landscaping bed outside your house.
Oh, okay. So they're natives that just sprung up in our garden, and we don't have any more room. So we just help the council along with their native planting here. Yeah, pseudopanics and grasses, quite hardy plants, and I hope that they'll live.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Kim, for sharing your insights into our new street, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much.
That was Kim, otherwise known as Ken.
I think that one's okay. Kia ora. My name's Lou and I work for the Christchurch City Council as the play advocate, and it would take me another 10 minutes to describe what that is, so I'll have to tell you another time. But what I wanted to share was actually that I spent a great deal of my childhood in a macrocarpentry at the top, mostly making quite elaborate booby traps to keep the boys out. And when I have conversations with people about their childhoods and their favourite play memories, there's a few common themes that come up a lot. And they're things like coming in when the street lights turn on, playing cricket on the street with their friends, knowing the best local climbing trees, and basically being out and about with our adults. I'm interested in the state of play in Aotearoa New Zealand because what we know from research undertaken by Sport New Zealand is that our children are not as active as they need to be, and also that the kind of play that we might think about and associate with our own childhoods is in steep decline in New Zealand. Play is more than just a way to fill in time. Put that nice picture up while I'm talking. It's more than just a way to fill in time. It's the foundation of our children's physical and emotional health, and the way that we as a society grow resilient, innovative, and independent adults. The kind of unstructured neighbourhood play that we took for granted is no longer accessible to many Christchurch children. And I think it's really important that we start unpacking why that is, and we look to be a part of the solution. Without a doubt, some of these factors are societal, but many of the reasons are environmental, and we need to look at the challenging way we have evolved our neighbourhoods so that children really aren't safe to get out and play, and parents don't necessarily feel that it's the right thing for their children to do. So to illustrate just how much things have changed, I want you to compare your own experience as children by looking at some of these statistics. I think the one that people find most confronting is the second one, that actually 85% of New Zealand children do not regularly leave their front gate to go and hang out with friends in the neighbourhood. I think it's overly simplified to assume that kids don't want to do this. We know from research, and I know from conversations with hundreds of children in Christchurch, that that's not the case. That actually, they want to play close to home. They want to get out and play. And some of the things that they really value the most are things that we might consider quite old-fashioned. I always find it quite reassuring in those conversations to learn that the kinds of things they really value and want to be able to do in their own neighbourhoods are the kinds of things that we value as well. I think it's really easy to say, well, kids just want to be on their devices. They don't want to play the way that we did. And what I'm hearing all the time from Christchurch children is that's not true. So without the time that I would need to break this down really deeply, we do see some common features in the neighbourhoods where residents tell us they see children all the time out and about playing. And I think it's helpful to understand what some of those features are. We have neighbourhoods that are intentionally working towards this, who want to create spaces where children feel they belong and they're able to get out and get to know their neighbours and be a part of their community. And we have other neighbourhoods where it just seems to happen. But I think it's important for us to look at both of those situations and understand what's going on there. So in the interest of keeping this brief, I've made a list. I don't think any of you will be surprised to hear that the number one thing we see is traffic calming measures. And I think this speaks to both the literal safety of children, but also we know that one of the number one barriers to independent play in our children is a parent's feeling of security about that. And parental anxiety is something that is it's supported with calmer streets. So we also know that these neighbourhoods have green spaces with big flat areas to kick a ball and make your own games, but they also incorporate wild areas, and I'm going to show you some examples of where that's part of the streetscape. Almost more important than that is the ability to get there and to have safe access to get to your local spaces and playgrounds, which is something that certainly children find very difficult to do in a lot of areas. A lot of spaces where we're seeing children out and about all the time have really active resident groups and playful interventions. And I'm going to show you some photos of some of my favourite ones. But we have lots of communities in Christchurch where residents are really engaged in creating little playful interventions and fun things for the kids. They have schools that are open after hours. And I think it's worth noting here that a lot of Christchurch schools don't open their gates after hours. And this can be a real problem if that is a community hub and a space for children to safely play, right from toddlers through to teenagers. And they have trees, including good climbing ones. So I love this quote by the author Tim Gill. And he talks about children as an indicator species for the health of a neighbourhood. So the mere presence of seeing children out playing in the neighbourhood indicates that, yeah, things are probably pretty healthy here. So I'm going to run through a handful of local examples where our indicator species are showing us, and from conversations I'm having with residents, that actually children do get out and play here because we have lots of spaces where residents tell us, actually, we never see kids. What a shame. When I grew up, I used to play on the street with the neighbours all the time. Why don't we see kids? And I think it's so important that we do unpack that and understand where things are working really well. Before I do that, I want to say that one thing we know for sure is that a sense of belonging and a well-connected community are two of the most important factors in whether or not children feel safe to go out and play. So I think in these examples, you'll see that we are lucky enough in Christchurch to have a handful of places where things are going pretty well. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, but I had to pick a few. So residents tell me that the presence of children increased greatly when the traffic speed came down. Children here are regularly seen out cycling, scootering and playing, and importantly, without adults. They're seen poking about in the river and playing in the slightly wild spaces around the park. The proximity of the park is really important because it's right next to the school. And because of that, there's passive surveillance on the school, which supports the school to keep its gates open after hours. Throughout Beckenham, there's lots of these little community-built play interventions, we'll call them. One 9-year-old that I spoke to told me that within walking distance of his house, he's counted 7, and he's allowed to go to all of them by himself, he told me very proudly. But they provide really important anchor points for children throughout the community, and they give them that message that actually you're important and you belong here, even though most of the roads are taken up with traffic. One other thing that I will say about those playful interventions is that research tells us that actually they're good for everyone, whether you're likely to engage or not. The mere presence of them in your neighbourhood and on your daily walks and as part of your neighbourhood is good for everybody's well-being. The next space I'm going to speak to is South Shore and South Brighton. I had some love. There's an intentional effort in these areas to bring the community together, and it shows. They have regular events such as Halloween and Matariki. They have things that are specifically set up for children, such as the painted Godwit walk and fairy houses. And what I heard from residents was they even leave sports equipment and seating out on the streets for people to play with. In terms of play and supervision and that feeling of safety, you can understand why parents feel that it's okay to let their children out to play in spaces like that. So St Albans is a relatively large area to cover in this, but I wanted to share some of the aspects that are contributing to a safe area for children. The park in the heart of St Albans is one that caters for a wide range of ages. But the bit that really interests me is this crossing, because we've made it easy for children to be able to get there by themselves in the first place across what would otherwise be quite a busy road. There's a fantastic community centre and connected community groups. And you can see that the community has started to install little interventions like this wonderful wee children's library. So one of the oldest suburbs in Christchurch is Richmond, and although it was badly affected by the earthquakes, this community has some of the most engaged groups, and their willingness to include children is evident when you go there. This is partly possible because of the space opening up in the red zone, but also because of people who realise that children need to be involved in the design of their spaces, such as these tree huts here that local children even come down and help to look after. I was lucky enough to talk to local tamariki, and it was really clear that they felt a strong sense of belonging in their neighbourhood, and I think that because they've been involved in so many projects, that's a good part of it. Something pretty special has been happening in Shirley. Lots of things, but I'm just going to talk about one. The Shirley Community Trust are doing things unlike what we've seen elsewhere. And one of the things that they've put in is the listening post. And if any of you are interested in community development or mental health, I'd recommend looking into this. But there is a space where children walk home from school, from various schools, and where that intersects, they've created an after-school play zone. And you can see the children playing here. And the point behind that was whakawhanongatanga, bringing this community together and giving those children safe spaces to play where their parents can come and be involved after school as well. And I think the impact that this has had on that community is really immense. I actually love this as an example of intervening within our neighbourhoods to ensure that children have accessible places to play, even in areas where perhaps the streets aren't quite set up yet for street-side play. That way. So what else has been done? I think the earthquakes shook up things enough for many of us to realise that actually the little things do matter. And we might as well have some fun because it can all disappear within the blink of an eye or a few aftershocks. I love the creativity that I'm seeing in lots of our Christchurch neighbourhoods and the many little ways in which children are celebrated and given easy access to the most vital conditions of play: time, space, and permission. And it's so important that when we're looking at our neighbourhood streets, if we consider, do children feel that they are allowed to come out and play here? What are we doing to stop that, and what are we doing to encourage it? We also need to remember that what works for adults isn't necessarily what works for our tamariki, but so often what works for them actually benefits the grown-up residents as well. And I want to add in here that my own sons have had many conversations with residents of a local rest home who head out for their daily walk and always feel delighted to see little boys frolicking about with cockabillies, and it was those rest home residents who actually taught them how to look for freshwater flounder, and now they have gone on to teach other little ones in the neighbourhood. And I think that kind of community interaction is really special. So I see Christchurch as a hub of innovation as we evolve into a shiny rebuilt city, and my hope is that our neighbourhoods foster the creativity that we need and benefit from in the not too distant future. Thank you very much.
Too short. There we go. Knew that was going to be an issue. Kia ora koutou. On the promo for this event, it discussed Chisnallwood students speaking with me. However, Year 8s are booked and busy. So they had to put their apologies in last minute, so you're stuck with me. My name's Hannah. I'm an engagement advisor at Christchurch City Council and led the engagement for the Aranui Streets project. My role is all about public participation. I'm not a transport specialist by any means, so this will all be about collaborating in street design, working with stakeholders, and receiving negative feedback on occasion. So this project was funded by Waka Kotahi's Streets for People program. Community collaboration using low-cost materials and trialling and adaptation, which you may recognise locally in projects like Colombo Street Open Play Street, Ferry Road Cycleway, and recently the Meet Me on Gloucester Trail right outside. I'm trying to wrap up 18 months of engagement in a 5-minute talk, so bear with me here. This was the project objective. Pretty vague, which is great, and the game plan itself. Early engagement, which is typical in a lot of our projects, but on steroids for this one, as we weren't starting with a scheme or really ideas at all. So it was developing all of that, and then the trial, where we'd test how it was going and adapt. From an engagement point of view, I thought this is great, an opportunity to let the community tell us what they want and we'll just do it. This turns out, as it turns out, was a very cute, very naive assumption. It didn't put enough emphasis on time or the community's lack of. And oddly enough, I'm not sure why the community doesn't necessarily want to spend all their spare time on council consultations. Trust that council will act on what they've told us when expectations had been raised and not met before, so why would it be different this time? And on top of all of that, understanding of a more complicated than normal offering of council processes, a broad but not too broad scope of discussion, and what's possible in street design. Our approach here was to talk to as many people as possible to get an understanding of barriers and ideas, only to be told a considerable amount of, this is a bit oversimplified. We did receive some insights, but there definitely weren't the, oh my goodness, I'm so glad you asked, moments that I'd hoped for. So back to the drawing board, we had the idea of doing student design jams with the 3 local schools. Over 2 days, students identified barriers that they currently had for walking and cycling, had a bit of a masterclass on street design principles and case studies, got to work on creating interventions that would help them and their whānau. And these workshops were really well received, and their ideas, including creating more spaces for pedestrians, new or improved crossing points, curved narrowing, speed humps, and a lot of art to, I quote, make the drivers think of us and be happier, cute, were drawn up by our designers and became this that we consulted on. The students championed this and became the local experts during this engagement period. Then came the trial, where a version of what was proposed by the students was constructed on the streets. Our engagement focus was ensuring that the Aranui community weren't treated as one homogenous group, that approaches to engagement and street design were tailored to the different communities. So examples were the school, we continued through our champions, we had community meetings with My FM, who are pictured there, Aranui Community Trust, people and brands that have a bit more mana than us in that community, harping back to the trust consideration. Businesses, we had one-on-one meetings, sometimes with interpreters, so that we could connect better. For example, here they had concerns around ram raids and the lack of beautification in the area, so we worked with them on these planter boxes that the students painted to reflect their place. Local residents, recognising that the whole scheme was a lot, we delivered material and did a lot of door knocking on a street-by-street basis and understood the really specific concerns of individuals and individual communities within that community and built relationships. And we looked for easy wins. Am I behind? No. Looked for easy wins, like adding flair to the utility boxes. But we received our fair share of negative feedback. This included features on breakfast television, a semi-viral TikTok, and some straight-up removal of trial infrastructure. But on reflection, it was during these times that the project really succeeded in my eyes, as we gained trust in the process and allowed people to focus their attention on what they liked. Some examples of this. Here, industrial stakeholders had submitted that one of the intersection changes wasn't working for them. So within the week, our team met them on site. The stakeholders had their biggest vehicle, their biggest truck. I mentioned I wasn't a transport specialist, right? Big truck. And we worked with them and mapped out what was needed at the time and made the changes right in front of them. There was also some pretty, how do I go? There we go. Pretty loud adversion to some changes along the park. So monitoring all feedback at the time, we made the executive decision on the day that it started getting noisy that we would make and communicate some change to that part of the trail. so that it didn't take away from the rest of the changes, which were quite sizable. People were really receptive to the conversations that I had during the trial, and I think that's because we'd adapted as we went, so they knew that we were doing what we said we would. We were listening. Finally, I learnt some stuff. So some fast facts on outcomes. For this project, we added 27 speed humps in, which is pretty massive, and they were supported largely by the community. Hampshire Street, which is a key activity area, had an average speed reduction of 12.4 kilometres an hour, and I'm told that that creates a 50% decrease in the likelihood of a crash causing a death or serious injury. There was a 14% increase of children travelling by non-car options, and we had a good understanding of feedback around curb build-outs, and we were able to make a recommendation to elected members, and the permanent project was adapted accordingly. Why did no one else have problems with it? So this was all achieved through the time, insights, and socialisation from the school kids. They put in a huge amount of work, they knew their community, and they were happy to be advocates. Meeting with the community and responding to feedback in considered and understanding ways, and taking on community advice. But I do think more could have been done in terms of taking on that advice. And my concluding remarks, overall we saw community connection through this project, even resulting in employment opportunities, which was amazing. Placemaking reflective of a community that we could not have done without them. We couldn't have got close. And I suppose speaking to the benefit of a trial format, we saw a considerably different outcome than what would have happened if we'd consulted on a plan alone. Again, apologies for hooning through this, but hopefully that was somewhat helpful in learning about how collaborating, working with stakeholders, and making the most of negative feedback can result in neighbourhoods with better streets.
Kia ora, ngā mihi to all our speakers, that's fantastic. I'd now like to welcome the panel up onto the stage, including the chair of the panel, Kamala Hayman, Westburn School Principal Susan Jennison, and coming back to the stage are Amory Head, Hannah Ballantyne, and Glen Koorey as well. And I will be relaying the questions, and if anyone does have a question for Louise, she's sitting right next to me so I can hand her the mic.
Kia ora. Can everyone hear me all right? Thank you for those fantastic presentations. I could have listened to a lot more detail on every single project. I thought it was really fantastic to be reminded that streets are not just places for the movement of cars. And I actually had a bit of a look at that before I came here tonight, and found some really interesting figures I was going to share with you. In 1915, 3/4 of all traffic in Christchurch was made up of bikes. And cars were just 3%. And right up until the 1950s, which isn't really that long ago, cars were outnumbered by bikes and other forms of transport. So it's really good that we can, it's not like radical to think that maybe roads aren't just about cars. And these guys have all worked on projects which show us that we can really do something to reclaim streets for people and other modes of transport. So I thought that a number of our panellists have worked all over the world, and while the talks have been focused on Christchurch, which I think is valuable to all of us, I wanted to open it to you all to sort of talk about maybe a street transformation that you've really loved that you might have seen here in Christchurch or elsewhere in the world. Glen, you've worked in transportation for about 30 years, and I wanted to just say, what's been one that you've really has stuck out as being a really successful project to improve a street?
I guess particularly a lot of good examples in Europe. I was lucky at my time at university to sort of go and do a study tour over there and see what they were doing all around Europe. I mean, there's some fantastic stuff. You name a country, they've got a very good job of doing quiet streets and communities from there. I suppose one example of a neighbourhood rather than just a street that I found really interesting was in Germany, in the city of Freiburg. Now, Freiburg is in sort of the southwest of Germany. It's really not much bigger than Christchurch. It's about up to 500,000. And it's kind of similar. It's sort of mostly flat and it's sort of got some foothills from there. And they've done a really good job of sustainable transport in general, and they've got tram networks and so forth. They've got two really interesting new developments they've done where they've, Vauban and Rieselfeld, they've created brand new subdivisions and they've made them easy for people to walk, bike, use public transport, and made them that much harder to drive because of the way they're laid out and how it is to get into the cars. And I've often thought we need to make subdivisions like that here in New Zealand as well.
Well, I think that's I wanted to sort of pick up on that point about the subdivisions, because here in Christchurch we are developing new subdivisions at a rate of knots. I think there's going to be fast-tracked 8,500 new houses around Christchurch. Is there an interest in how the streets are laid out in those subdivisions? Are you or Anne-Marie aware of are subdivision developers seeking advice on how they can make their streets better in their subdivisions or not?
Well, of course, some of them are, and those are the ones we're talking to. But I guess in general, a cul-de-sac is great, and I lived in a cul-de-sac as a child, and I think my parents chose the house that we lived in because it was in a cul-de-sac, so we could play at the end of the street there. But not everyone can live at the end of a cul-de-sac. So we've kind of got ourselves into this position where everyone wants the end of a cul-de-sac so that their kids can play, but that can't happen. So we've got to think about other ways of doing things and actually having connected streets for walking and cycling, but not necessarily connected in every which way for all the vehicles, is a way of keeping the volumes low and slow, which is what I talked about in my talk. So that's kind of the focus, or one of the areas that we'd be wanting to help developers with.
All right, well, it's good to know that they are actually connecting with you, and might see some really good new developments. Hannah, you're working in streets that already exist, and you talked us through the Aranui project, which sounded like quite a complex piece of work, and you talked through all the barriers and some of the feedback you got, and I wanted to pick up on two things that you raised, and one was the engagement process and the trial period. Now, they sound like kind of costly ways to do a project. Is that a barrier, just having the money to do these transformations and run a trial before you lock in infrastructure?
Yeah, it's definitely a more lengthy process for engagement. But typically trials use lower cost infrastructure. So haven't got the numbers on me as to what works out cheaper in the long run, but it's a longer process. It's more involved from a community engagement point of view. But there's costs on both types.
The Streets for People program that this was part of has finished this year, and it doesn't. There's more government funding for it, but are similar projects going to carry on anyway with council funding or other sources of funding, or are we just going to put that to one side for a wee while?
I don't know that there's any trials in the pipeline, but it is something that we can do if there's demand or elected member requests. We've got options.
Oh, that's good to hear. Okay, thank you. Susan, I'm going to introduce you to the group. Susan is, as Jess said, principal at Westbourne School, and the school is in Burnside, and it's on some very busy streets nearby, and there was an intersection very near the school which was quite dangerous. They had 13 crashes in 10 years, and I think it sounds like it was pretty hard for kids to get to and from school safely. So what did you do about that?
Well, we were very fortunate to be able to undertake a school transport plan in association with council staff and survey our families as to what they saw as the greatest need in the area. and surveyed our students and mobilised them, as the Chisnell Wood students did as well. And we had engineers out to look at the ideas that we said were causing safety issues for our children, and we identified that the roundabout at Graham's Road and Waimairi Road, children were obscured by agapanthus when they were in bloom. Some of our 5-year-olds aren't huge, and cars motor through there in the morning, and cars that are turning left from Graham's Road into Waimairi Road, they don't even look. And there is actually no footpath on that side of the road. So our children were at more risk. And if you're crossing the roundabout, as one of our mums was, with a pram, 2 children and a dog every day, it's really challenging to make sure everyone's safe. We were really fortunate that we benefited from a trial, just as Hannah said, and some safety treatments were put into the roundabout and trialled for 9 months. And then our children were able to make a submission to the community board on what they saw as the benefits from that. We know that not all motorists and local residents saw it the same way as we did, but student safety was the most important thing for us. And anecdotally, the research that the council did and that we did ourselves found out that our community felt so much safer knowing that the speed was reduced by the traffic cushions. They haven't removed the left turning lane just yet, but we'll work on that next.
What about the agapanthus?
Oh, the council have been amazing. They come and trim the agapanthus in bloom every year as soon as it starts to flower, which is a shame, but it means our little 5-year-olds can be seen. So that's great.
Good to know. So you call them speed cushions. Some people call them speed humps. And I think maybe there were some speed humps in the Sheldon Street project, and certainly I think you referred to quite a few speed humps in the Aranui project. Speed humps are, I'm just going to tell you a quote I've got here about speed humps from our Transport Minister.
Glowing.
He says that speed humps make it really difficult for New Zealanders to get about in their day-to-day lives, and they're not going to fund any more of them. And there's about 70 schools around the country that were expecting some government funding for speed humps. So they're going to have to find funding from somewhere else if they want them. Susan, how do you feel about that? Have they been really important for the traffic management near your school?
Absolutely. I think that's really short-sighted. It might make it slower for drivers or less comfortable for drivers, but it certainly makes it safer for pedestrians, older people, children in the area.
Thank you. And maybe Anne-Marie or Glenn, as traffic engineers, Simeon Brown says they cost about $500,000 each. Is that, in your experience, about right?
Not even close, no. I mean, there was a quote about one particular case, I think, in Auckland that, for whatever reason, blew out in cost. But actually, most of them, you'd be lucky if you're even spending $100,000. In fact, a lot of the quick build ones, they're $20,000-$30,000, and they can design them so they pop them down over a weekend.
So they're quite cost effective. You probably don't need waka kotahi money for them. Probably could be done anyway. So we're not going to see the end of speed humps, probably in Christchurch. Now, while we're also talking about reducing speed, many of us who live in Christchurch will have seen quite a proliferation of 30km/h streets around Christchurch and in our neighbourhoods. And I think, Glenn, you did a really fantastic job of explaining what a difference it can make if there's a slow speed, traffic moves more slowly, people start to use the street for other things than driving, and what a difference it makes to play and kids. However, I hate to quote Simeon Brown again, but I really need to bring him into this conversation because he wants all of our 30k roads returned to 50km/h by July next year, I think, because it doesn't make sense for a tradie heading to work at 5 o'clock in the morning to have to crawl around at 30km/h. I mean, can't get to work in a reasonable speed. So what do you say to that?
I say you should see how early some children arrive at school in the morning, and they will be out at the same time as the tradie. It just makes no sense whatsoever to prioritise adults who can better make decisions than our children who can't.
Would you like to, Anne-Marie?
The other thing is when we're talking about 30km/h streets in our neighbourhood streets, that's not every street. And so the tradie that's going to work shouldn't be rat running all the way through their neighbourhood streets all the way to work. They should just use their small little piece until they get to an arterial road, which is 50 or 60, and then get on their way. So I don't see what the problem is, really.
Hannah, I don't want to put you in a difficult position, but what's the council process around this? I'm quite interested. Do we reconsult on which streets should go back to 50k, or does it just happen?
We're currently looking into the implications of the rule change and what that might mean, so we're seeking advice. We don't believe it currently looks like we would be consulting. Yeah.
Okay, all right, that's clear. Glenn, did you want to say anything about the reversal of speed limit changes?
Well, we know the safety benefits already from what we've seen reducing them. We look at even Christchurch, they introduced lower speeds in the CBD, a number of suburbs, and we've seen 30, 40, 50% reduction in casualties on those ones. And the same story is repeated around the country. So it's a bit of a nonsense to go backwards. Your 5 a.m. tradie, well, he's probably not going to have traffic on the other street, so he's probably actually going to have a quicker time, even if he has to do 30 on that street.
Hannah, what kind of feedback have you had when you've consulted on going from 50 to 30? Are people concerned? Are residents concerned? Or do they welcome it? Or do you having a mix? What kind of things have you heard?
So we started doing our kind of large speed change consultations a few years ago, and those first ones came from community requests. So they were neighbourhood by neighbourhood. And like speed humps, they're controversial. I think sometimes it's amped up how controversial, but they are controversial. But yeah, as those original ones did come as requests from the community. And then when we consulted on the interim speed management plan, and then the speed management plan last year, feedback was pretty split. But yeah, some people are huge advocates for speed reduction, and yeah, some are. It becomes quite ideological.
Right, so you just have to kind of manage that. I mean, move on to another topic. Look, Christchurch is really car crazy. I mean, there's lots of different measures that you can look at, but depending on the statistics you use, we've got some of the highest rates of car ownership in the country and possibly in the world in terms of comparable cities. How does that kind of impact the changes that you might want to bring about to make a road less about cars and more about people and other modes of transport? Is it harder in Christchurch to make those changes than other cities? Who wants to talk to that? Anne-Marie?
I actually think it's easier because we've got more space. So I've been doing a bit of work in Wellington, and they really, well, everyone knows in the media the problem is there, but they struggle with narrow streets where they're trying to fit a lot of different things in. Lots of houses don't have off-street parking like we do here in Christchurch, or tend to have. And the topography as well makes things tricky. So I don't think we should say that it's harder here. I think it's easier. I think we're quite lucky.
All right. I mean, despite our obsession with cars, we're also pretty good at cycling, it looks like. The latest census figures show that nationally, the proportion of people cycling to work actually fell. It's just under 2%. But here in Christchurch, it actually rose, and it's about 6% of people are cycling to work. So that, we've got lots of cars and bikes in our garages, I presume. Anne-Marie, what role does street design play in encouraging cycling? I mean, is some of the work that you guys have done and Hannah's done encouraged us to increase our cycling rates, do you think?
Well, of course, the major cycleways where Sheldon Street is one is really going to help, but it's not just about major cycleways that will get someone to cycle, because chances are you don't live on a cycleway and, say, work on the other end of a cycleway. So it's all those connecting bits that are important too. And that's why we need to get these neighbourhood greenways happening at a finer grain than just the major cycleway routes.
Okay. How expensive is a greenway. Is that a barrier? Is it just getting the funding for them, or is that...
They're actually relatively cheap compared to some of the other options. That was another project I had some students look at a dozen years ago, and when you look at the components to do them, most of the cost is like what you do at the intersections. In the middle of the street, you're not doing much, a few street trees and bumps. You compare that with what you've often got to do for a full separated cycleway. They're pretty good value, and you've hung on to a lot of the parking as well.
So do we need separated cycleways, or a few trees and built out curbs do the trick?
Yeah, I mean, you've got to look at your route. A busy street, you want to have separation if you want to get people cycling. But the quiet streets, and we've got lots of opportunities, that's where you can be building that model. And we've seen the growth as a result of it. It's about 40% growth in cycling numbers as we've been building them in the last half a dozen years.
Susan, has slowing the traffic down a bit helped your school in terms of more kids walking or cycling to school? How has that impacted your community?
Actually, anecdotally, I'd say it hasn't, and that's because every school is so different. So our school, the traffic outside our school in the morning is at standstill and crawling, so speed actually isn't an issue, it's more parent parking that's an issue for us. That would be the biggest thing. That would make the biggest difference for us if parents were better at parking. We also have a highly migrant community, and many of those people have come from countries where they don't feel safe and comfortable letting their children out on the streets by themselves anyway. And even if they live within easy walking distance, some of them will still drive to school anyway.
Yeah.
Just the way it is. Every school's different.
Yep, so there's a lot of cultural issues as well, isn't there? It's not all about street design. You mentioned car parking. I think car parking's something that people in Christchurch love to talk about. I think another statistic, bear with me, Christchurch has one car park in the city centre for every 3.5 people who work in the city. So we're doing pretty well. Auckland has only half that number, and Wellington probably a third. So yet despite that, if you remove any parking, there seems to be a bit of a negative feedback. Hannah, can you talk to that when you've done changes? What happens when you remove 8 car parks from a street?
I think I should have just a play button that says, yep, that's controversial. Yes, that is controversial, Kamala. If we're removing car parking in a scheme, I can't think of a time where we've consulted on a plan that removes parking that we haven't heard about it. But there is also the flip side where we do hear people say that they don't mind, they'd like us to remove more because they feel safer without it. So there's two sides to every coin, and we hear that pretty much in every project. So our elected members have a difficult time. Maybe. They might find it easy, I don't know.
Glen, you actually mentioned that sometimes a lot of parking along a street, I presume, narrows it and makes it actually slower and a bit safer. So you're in favour of more parking, or...?
Well, in some places you've got no choice, I guess, because of the way we're building up, and you don't have so much off-street parking. I look at the units right next to us, for example, and there's one space per unit, so I guess everyone else is fighting for the street. Parking though is interesting in that it depends whether it's being used. It's one thing to say you're losing all this parking, but we know so many streets, and you saw some photo examples I showed, where those people aren't actually parking on those spaces anyway. So saying you're going to lose 20 car parks, those 20 car parks weren't being used. And so sometimes we've got to reframe how we do it and say, look, even when we take away these car parks, you're still going to have some space for the demand that's left.
Good point.
And we do try and talk about that. We do often parking occupancy surveys prior to a proposal, so we can really contextualise the change. So yes, you may be losing 20 car parks, but from our surveying it looks like there'll be enough to satisfy the current demand.
Okay. I'm conscious we've got some audience questions. Would you like to ask something from the audience?
Yes, please.
Yes.
We've got quite a few. Some of them are quite similar to each other, so people who've asked them, I'm going to mash them together. There are a couple that are about dealing with opposition. You know, its opposition is rife and organised. How do you deal with a loud vocal minority who are opposed to these kinds of changes to our neighbourhood streets?
How do you...
Is the trial, is that a really good way of dealing with it?
It's a good way of seeing if, for residents to see if their fears are valid, because they can fully experience it and yeah, figure it out once they do. Other than that, we talk a lot about, when we're consulting on changes, trying to meet with residents, curb misinformation, do a lot of that proactively, which we haven't done as well of previously. So that's a way, and having really reasonable discussions with residents. I think often the end goal between council and consultants and the community is pretty similar. Most people want safer streets. It's just some differing ideas on how to get there, and that's valid views. So my job is to present those views and make sure that everyone feels like they have a voice and that things aren't happening to them.
Thank you.
Somebody asks, how can we get the speed limits in our neighbourhoods lowered? My question is it possible under current central government policy?
Going to loop back to, we're still looking at the implications of that for council. Historically, you could request it through just talking with council, and then we'd look into it within a work program. Now, I'm not sure, but we'll communicate that once we know.
There are about three questions about cultural change, education. I guess it relates to that, how do you deal with a loud vocal minority, but it's more positive, you know, how do you deal with driver culture? Do we need to change driver culture?
I've found it quite interesting today, if you've read the press, there's been a lot of pushback about the roundabout at Cashmere, Dyers Pass, and fun comments. I may have contributed to one or two of them. But, you know, it was interesting, the theme for a lot of people sort of saying, oh, it's terrible for driving, all the rest, how are you going to do it? Yeah, a lot of people are saying that's kind of the point, is that you have to pay attention, you have to slow down now. That's what these things are for, and then maybe you won't have serious outcomes out the other end. So, and the more we do those things and tell the good news stories and say, look, we did it here and crashes, casualties have dropped by X amount, hopefully people will start to get it.
There's a question that I can't find because there's so many questions about how do we educate people about how to use these changed street designs, like what a sharrow is, you know, how to navigate some of these designs that we get. Do people need education on them?
I believe Christchurch City Council has a marketing campaign on how to use sharrows out at the moment. So, yeah, good question. Things like that. So we're trying to put it in front of people to make sure that they understand what a cycle in the middle of the road means, and so for cyclists and drivers can navigate those spaces safely.
Cool. There's a question, someone's comments, amazing street improvements, great to see. I do wonder about all the road markings and sometimes feel like it creates visual clutter. Is there a way to achieve the same outcome without the markings?
This is one of my bugbears because I have the same view that sometimes there's a sign added for the sake of a sign, and you have signs on signs, for example, and markings are the same. I guess what we, or myself and Glen as transport engineers, are trying to do is balance what is required in the regulations versus what someone needs to understand how the street works and what they should be doing. I don't know if we always get that right, and sometimes we're a bit hamstrung with legislation that's not keeping up with the way things are changing so quickly these days. Do you agree, Glenn?
Yeah, it is a challenge. I mean, I'm involved with a group that sort of looks at updating traffic control devices, as they're called, signs and markings, and the pace is slow just getting things changed over time. Even when you think that's a good idea, well, talk to me in 2 years' time when they might change the legislation.
There's a question, someone observes that Christchurch has a lot of missing footpaths, missing pedestrian legs at signalised intersections, power poles and footpaths. How do we fix those?
Just do it.
I can say we asked the council about the missing footpath on the northern boundary by our roundabout, but it's on the side of a creek, and there would need to be a retaining wall, there'd need to be extra space put in, and the cost was prohibitive, and it's not in the council's current plan, was what we were told. You can't say it, but I can.
You can request though, and like that example would look into it and provide some advice on whether it's doable or not.
There's also the Snap, Send, Solve app. I think if enough people noted something, then it might happen.
Yeah, if there's damage or a safety concern, then Snap, Send, Solve is a great tool. So that's an app you can download on your phone, take a photo, and it logs a ticket with the appropriate organisation.
There is a question about someone who lives on a narrow street and people park on the footpath to widen the road. Maybe they're worried about their cars being hit, but that just means that the traffic goes faster. Would Snap, Send and Solve be a way to deal with that? Because they ask how to stop it.
Just getting in contact with council if it's illegal parking, and our enforcement team prioritise work and can go and check it out.
Cool, thank you. Oh, no, they won't be able to hear you over our live stream audience, Anna, thanks though. We've got about a minute left. Do you want the last question, Kamala?
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Jess. I wanted to with a lot of the questions, people were asking, what can we do in our own neighbourhoods? So I wanted to actually ask each person here, Susan, you really made change happen. How did you do that? And I wondered if the others wanted to also think about what's one quick thing you can do if you want your neighbourhood street to be a safer street.
I'd taupo what Hannah said and get children involved. When our children went to the community board to protest that the treatments needed to be made permanent, and from a child's perspective, it certainly held some sway.
Good advice.
I'd say get to know your neighbours better. So if you know your neighbours, you're going to be out on the street more, you're going to start talking about things, you'll learn stuff you didn't know, and you never know what will happen from there.
Stay up to date with council projects. We consult on a lot. We've got a big work program and a lot of proposed changes for the community, and a lot of them involve street design. So let's talk.ccc.govt.nz. You can create an account, be notified when a project opens that affects you, and you can make a submission so that you're heard.
Wonderful. Len?
Look for opportunities in your community to connect. I live across the road from a school. They often do school fairs and events there. Around the corner there's a community drop-in centre. So there are places that you can try and connect with the people around you. Even when we go for a walk around the block with the dog, we get to know the neighbours. So.
Excellent. All right, well, thank you. Lots of wonderful advice there for everyone, and some really inspiring projects that you guys have worked on. So that wraps it up for the panel discussion. I think we go back to Jess to wrap up for the evening. Thank you, everyone.
O tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi o te pō. Thank you to the panel. That was so interesting. I had to restrain myself from wanting to leap in there too, Jess. So good reminder that people at home can't hear us. Ko waio, ko Ciaran Fox, tōko ingoa. My name is Ciaran Fox. I'm a public health specialist and a poet, and that is why I'm here, because I am fascinated at how our capacity for creativity, arts and culture can lead new ways of thinking and looking at issues. It kind of enables us to kind of hold things up to the light and look at them in a slightly different way. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our invited poet for the evening. We always invite a poet to come along and add new layers of meaning making to the kaupapa of the night. And one of my favourite quotes about poetry is that it can give voice to the voiceless. And I think that's a wonderful segue into introducing our wonderful poet, Jessica Arcus, who is a poet who feels compelled to give voice to the quiet and overlooked things, watching for divine presence in the day-to-dayness of life. I like that line, Jess, the day-to-dayness of life. She has been published in journals both in New Zealand and abroad, and lives in Pūtahi with her husband and 2 daughters. She can often be spotted riding around the city with her daughters in their cargo bike, smelling the air and exclaiming loudly about beautiful things, which if you can't see the daughters in the bike, just exclaiming loudly, that's just poet things, isn't it, really? About things like blossoms, clouds, and also probably a cyclist's finest and favourite moment, which is passing lines of waiting traffic. So please give a warm welcome to the poet Jessica Arcus.
Kia ora koutou, thanks Ciaran. This has been absolutely fascinating. I actually live on Roker Street, which is a cycleway, and my daughters often, when it's been raining, they'll go and play in the flooded gutter and stuff. They also have just started, they're 7 and 9 now, they've started walking our little Jack Russell around the block. We've got friends around the block who then join them, and they like do laps of the block, and they feel like awesome and independent, and it's cool that me and my husband feel like it's safe enough for them to do that. As Ciaran mentioned, I've got an e-cargo bike that we use daily for the commute into school and things. My daughters are buckled in the front, but I love that as I bike, the kids and I are immersed in the surroundings, and we become acutely aware of like the seasons, the drama of the sky, and then we can also talk to other cyclists while we're waiting at the lights. And often when I reach my destination, I feel better than I did when I left home. But I really, do believe that we are more compelled to care for the environment we inhabit and the people who inhabit it when we feel like we're a part of it. And so I guess that's where having better streets is really important for us all. So my poems, I've got 2 tonight. They're based on musings that centre around the best parts of streets, the connection that can happen within them, the play and fun and exploration they can foster for kids, and the sense of belonging they can create with each other in the natural world. So I'm going to start with a wee blessing for the streets. It's called Bless the Streets, funnily enough. Bless the streets. Bless hot tar sticky on bare feet. Bless the dairy round the corner, white bread, blue milk, gold coins singing in kids' pockets, scooters piled high, then the rush of a little bit of sugar, rush of a little bit of independence, and the push coast, up and over that perfect tar-sealed tree root jump, fast past the staffy always barking at the push coast, coast, coast. Bless the box of free feijoas, giant plane tree inviting impromptu picnic, impromptu bark peeling, daisy chain creating, fairy circle making. Bless the spots left open to gaze up wondering. The spots left quiet, bar perhaps the ding and whir of push bike, e-bike, cargo bike, chatter of children buckled in the front, knees curled, heads tilted skywards to catch the best part of the breeze, the trees, the best roof over their heads. Blessed be the slow streets, low fences, faces, seeing faces, seeing faces. Thank you. This one's called Sometimes It's Like This. On my way out the door, meeting a friend, only 4 short blocks to the local. We'll pick her up on foot, walk the rest of the way together. I kiss the husband and he doesn't say, make sure you keep safe. And I don't say, I'll carry a key like a knife just in case. Instead, the blue-grey nighttime city sky appears around me like pockets of eternity, marked and counted by rooftops and arching streaks of cirrus. Blossom scent warms the night air and I can't help but reach out and touch the decadent bunches of heavy yellow corfi blooms hanging like ripe grapes. On Prosser Street now, and darkness cloaks me like a reward. Jonquils beckon, and I must kneel. I must bow, knee to rough concrete curb, receive their richness. The friend appears like a sure-footed apparition, joins me in the sanctity of this street, connected to that street, connected to this person, connected to that person, connected to this land, connected to those lands, connected by sea, by sky, by rooftop moon and cirrus in the grey-blue city darkness, showing us what belonging could feel like. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Simon Kingham. I've been asked to summarise some things and think about what we might do. Just to introduce myself, I'm a professor of geography at the University of Canterbury, and for 6 years, until May this year, I was the Chief Science Advisor at the Ministry of Transport. Stop laughing, people. And I would like to say that it's fair to say for the last 6 months they didn't ask for my advice, so it's not my fault. I think it's fair to say from central government we're not feeling the love. I guess at least we're not Wellington, because I think they're feeling the love even less. And with the love in the past has come funding. So how do we do innovating streets and streets for people when we've got no money? What can we do? And I think there's a few things we can do, and some of them have been touched on already. What can we do locally? Well, Lou talked about creating places for kids to congregate and do stuff. And I think one of the themes is we talked a bit about that, creating places where people can get to know their neighbours. And in the academia, we've termed the phrase, or coined the phrase, bumping places and gathering places. And the idea is you can create places where people can gather. And it happens in some communities, but we can create it. So we saw a picture of a basketball hoop, which is quite close to where I live. It's actually outside my house. And I put it up there a few years ago because my son said he wanted to play basketball. And I looked around and I wondered where he could play basketball. And I found this really big bit of tarmac called the road. And I thought, well, let's see if we can do something there. So I bought a basketball hoop for $18 on Trade Me, and I put it on the street. And I went to a council meeting a few days later, and I said, look, I put this thing on, and I think and kids are using it, and it's placemaking, it's created a place for gathering. And I think I'm okay, I don't think it breaks any rules, but just don't tell anyone in the council. And the mayor was sitting in front of me at the time. Unfortunately, no one thinks it's a bad idea, whether it's within the rules or not. It's a good idea, right? Because now kids come and play basketball. And then eventually I thought I'll put a ball out there. So originally kids came and they just played, bought their own ball. I put one ball there. Today there are 5. Now I don't know whether there's something we don't know about basketballs, but I don't think they breed. And the reality is that kids play basketball every day. And there was one day when I saw this little tiny girl with her mum, and she was standing by the basketballs, and the mum said, this little tiny girl walks past and stops there to count how many balls are there. So there are things we can do. We can create that. Another example, we can put benches out. I was talking to someone else who's put a swing on their local tree. And so what we can do is we create places for neighbourhoods to bump into each other and to know their neighbours. And particularly, we can create places for kids. I think the second thing we can do is we can advocate for things. One of the messages I've got very clearly from Hannah tonight is that if you ask council, council are really receptive. And so we need to get our communities to ask council for things. One example might be that we tell council we quite like low speed limits. And one of the hints in the legislation about speed limits is that if there's community support, they might possibly be allowed to stay. We're not quite sure. I think, as you said, we're working that one out. But the point is, tell councils if we like them. We can also do other things, like we can tell councils we would like streets restricted to through traffic. And I think technically we sometimes call it filtered permeability. So we can create cul-de-sacs. I think Anne-Marie talked about cul-de-sacs. Well, perhaps we can ask council to create cul-de-sacs because it's not impossible. We can also organise local events. We can organise play streets. Council still gives money for street barbecues, so we can organise street barbecues. And in our own community, one year we actually put an outdoor film on, and the weather was kind, and we got about 100 people there, which was great. So I think what we can do is we can create demand. And when we create demand and we want to go to council to tell them, take the kids along. We know that taking the school kids along is powerful, and it's often the kids who want these things, so say that. So what do we say to council? I would say to council, don't give up. We will feel the love one day again. From central government. Keep doing the good things because the evidence supports them. The science is really clear. They work. They deliver really good outcomes, as we've seen tonight. I think we need to keep selling the vision of what we're doing. Actually, it's interesting that the government talks about benefit-cost ratios and value for money. Actually, the best value for money we ever get is these sorts of projects. We need to keep telling people of the value of these projects. I think we also need to use inspiring stories, and we've seen these tonight. We've seen amazing stories at Westburn School. We've seen amazing streets where people live, about the amazing outcomes and the cool things that are happening. We need to start selling those and telling them more. Finally, I want to say we need to listen to the science, not the whingers, dare I say. I don't know if some of you mentioned this morning the headline, and I'd love to have a word with the press headline writer, about a roundabout being an abomination. Interestingly, that article, if you read it, it talked about people not liking the roundabout. What's interesting, completely accidentally, the chair of our local neighbourhood association in Beckenham had just happened to have done a survey, and he's in the room, so hats off to him, happened to have sent a survey out to our local community asking people what they thought about that roundabout, and 80% people said it made it better. Now, that did get in the paper, only the online version, unfortunately. But actually, I would like to suggest an alternative headline saying 80% of local residents like the roundabout. So, because actually, that was not a huge sample, but it was 30 people. It wasn't 4 people who saw that the press were looking for a story and said this is an abomination. So I think sometimes we need to listen to the majority who are often silent rather than the loud minority who regularly contact Hannah and let them know what they think. And I think we need to also look at the way we communicate with our communities, and Dave Kelly and the Beckenham Neighbourhood Association is a good way, sending out a survey asking people. 80% of people said they like it. 96%, I think, said they want lower speed limits. So let's keep using our community and listen to the visions, listen to what they're saying. Finally, trials. We need to keep doing trials. Trials as consultation. We're doing a piece of research at the moment asking people what they think of projects after they've been put in place, because we know people struggle with change. And if you say you're going to take some parking away and close their street, they don't like it. But sometimes, we might find out soon, after a year or so you go back to them, I suspect many of them will say, actually, it's better now. So this is the beauty of trials. So I'll just end by saying we might not be feeling the love at the moment, but there's lots of things we can do. And let's not give up hope, because there is some exciting stories, and we've seen many of them tonight. So let's keep up the good work, and one day we'll feel the love again. Thank you.
Okay, short person alert. A huge thank you. That was amazing. When we thought of this topic, this has exceeded our expectations. So a huge thank you to all our speakers and to our panellists and to our poet, charging our imaginations, which is what we wanted to do. And a big thanks to our supporters, Christchurch City Council Sustainability Fund, and Professor Amanda Yates at AUT Hepuna Tōra Regenerative Action Lab. A quick shout out for the final Christchurch Conversation of the year, which is on Tuesday the 26th of November. It's called Building for Soil Health. Again, we have some fantastic speakers for that event, including kaupapa Māori researcher Jessica Hutchings, who's about to be a TV star, and urbanist Zoe Avery. And their conversation is going to put the health of soil at the centre of how we could plan and build our cities. And you can book for this now, links on our website. Thanks everyone for coming. See you next time. Become the silent minority, if we are one, needs to find and use its voice. That's what we need to do as we leave. Okay, pō Māori o koutou. Thanks.